couple days ago, somebody posted this question to me on my YouTube channel, and I thought I would devote this video to answering it. So, Esquire Whitney says, I've been following your content for many years and I love it. Yes, that's what we want to hear. Esquire goes on and says, I've also read some of your books. Esquire doesn't say that the books are loved, alas, but anyway, moving on. However, one thing that has stood out to me lately is that almost all your content focuses on either exposing problematic Christian thought or defending your more controversial takes. Well, controversy is relative, right? Anyway, I would love to hear a video sometime explaining what convinces you that Christianity is true and why you have decided to live as a Christian. You have already defended Christianity as credible, but I would love for you to go beyond that to why you think it is probable, or at least a faith you want to follow. I think that could be really interesting. Now, I've had a question like this before, and I believe I've done a previous video on it, but honestly, I make 300 videos a year or so, so don't expect me to remember everything I've previously said on different topics. But I thought I would devote some time to answering this question. Well, first of all, okay, so it's like, why do you not defend Christianity, provide a positive apologetic case? Well, I guess there's two parts here. One part is sort of share your own personal biography, and the other part of it is why do you not do more conventional positive apologetics? Maybe those are two different issues because it remains to be seen the degree to which a positive apologetic conventional argument is part of my own intellectual biography. Let's just sort this out. First of all, I'll just say this. I've written 3 books doing what you can call sort of conventional positive apologetics. 2 of those books were co-authored. So back in 2013, I wrote God or Godless with John Loftus. Each one of us did 10 debate proposals where we argued the positive resolution on something, and the other one argued the contrary. And so that was a collection of 20 short debates. And I thought that was a great sampler of a book. And in 2016, I wrote An Atheist and a Christian Walk into a Bar with Justin Schieber, an atheist. And there we had longer conventional chapters debating various topics positively and negatively for each one of us. And then back in 2012, I had written The Swedish Atheist, The Scuba Diver, and Other Apologetic Rabbit Trails, again, including several conventional sort of apologetic arguments. So I've certainly done my work in this area. I would dare say more than most apologists. I've written 3 books on the topic, and I don't know how many formal debates I've done, most of which are available online, but I'm guessing it's somewhere around 50. And of those, probably 10 of them involved debates on conventional topics. So arguing for various things in terms of arguments for God's existence, arguing for the historicity of the resurrection, and so on. So I've certainly done that. And I think that is all important and of value. It is pretty clear that it's not, I would say, my heartbeat. Let me say this, though, just personally, first of all, about arguments for God's existence. The ones that I find to be most compelling or intriguing, for me, it's moral arguments. That's the one that really hits home the most. You may see that in the piss and vinegar that is found in my book, Jesus Loves Canaanites. I really am compelled by moral value and moral obligation. But when it comes to moral arguments, I'm not as compelled by moral arguments that depend on the existence of moral value, which is where William Lane Craig, for example, famously will argue that if God does not exist, then there is no good and evil. And I'm not so compelled by that. I think it's not hard for me to envision an atheistic universe, in other words, a universe where there's no personal deity in which good and evil still exists. It's just part of the basic furniture of the universe, just like God is understood to be part of the basic furniture of the universe. This would not be naturalism, clearly, but it could be something like the Platonic view, where there is just some absolute good, and state of affairs and actions either instantiate or fail to instantiate that good, that Platonic good that exists. It's not hard for me to conceive of that as a metaphysical construct at all. But I think it's much harder that theism is favored when it comes to morality in two other areas. And the first is moral obligation. So it's one thing to say, oh, good and evil exists. Sorry, Timbit wants to be picked up. Timbit. It's one thing to say that good and evil exist. It's another thing to say, I have some obligation to act in accord with the good rather than the evil. And I think that we have a perception of moral obligation, which I've talked about, I think, particularly in this book with Justin Schieber, if memory serves. Well, it came out 9 years ago. I don't remember everything I said, right? So, anyway, I think that we do have moral obligations to follow that are best explained in terms of theism rather than a non-theistic view. So, moral obligation, an argument for God for moral obligation for me is quite compelling. And also arguments for moral knowledge, because I'm somewhat persuaded by the arguments of people like Alvin Plantinga, his evolutionary argument against naturalism, that we should have a low confidence that naturalism would fit us with truth conducive beliefs rather than merely adaptive beliefs. If evolution is the only thing that guides the emergence of our cognitive faculties, I think we would have prima facie a low grade reason to believe that our cognitive faculties are in fact producing true beliefs. We know that they would help us to adapt to the environment or we wouldn't have survived, but it doesn't mean that they have given us truth. And this just extends to moral truth. So knowledge about good and evil, right and wrong, what you ought and ought not to do. I think on a merely non-theistic and evolutionary account of the origin of our moral cognitive faculties, we would have a low reason to have confidence in our moral knowledge. And yet it seems to me that our moral knowledge of our most basic obligations and our most basic sense of good and evil, that is very secure. So it seems to me that that is a compelling argument, or at least a persuasive argument for theism rather than atheism. I also think that some forms of the teleological design arguments are compelling. I'm just less persuaded by cosmological arguments myself. And we could go on from there. I think that ontological arguments are interesting, but it seems to me they either show that God, under some particular definition, either must exist or could not possibly exist. And it doesn't get you much further than that, so I'm not really compelled by that. I find the arguments for the resurrection of Jesus to be interesting and worthwhile, and I think they make a belief in the resurrection of Jesus reasonable. I think it is reasonable on historical grounds to believe Jesus rose from the dead, particularly if you don't have some overriding naturalist opposition to the existence of God or the possibility of miracles or the knowability of miracles. But I also think that Christian theists often overplay their hand by suggesting that the evidence for the historical resurrection of Jesus is somehow compelling, so that a person cannot be reasonable and fail to accept that evidence. And then there's many other arguments as well. But for me, the really important thing here is that it's never been so much about arguments. This goes back to the little bit of my intellectual biography. Let's skip down here now. A little bit of my intellectual biography. So I took a class with Alvin Plantinga back in 1998, and the class was on warranted Christian belief. Now, warranted Christian belief wouldn't be published for another 2 years, but he had a working manuscript that he used in the class. And I was really impacted by his arguments. And at that point, the seed was planted in 1998 that I began to think less in terms of the William Lane Craig style of apologetics, where you provide a positive case, classic apologetics, and more in terms of the reformed epistemological approach, where you focus less on providing a positive case and more on removing defeaters, recognizing that for the most part, people become Christians and form Christian beliefs because it just seems right to them. It seems to be it's formed in a properly basic manner, uh, and from a theological lens through the internal instigation of the Holy Spirit, one might say. And what you want to do is you want to just remove defeaters or objections that people might have. And because I think there's so many defeaters that are just part of the furniture of evangelical apologetics. I wanted to focus a lot of my attention on removing the defeaters in apologetics itself and clearing the way for people simply to be able to become Christians or to maintain an integral Christian faith. So I focus on things like removing the objection of biblical violence. So when you have Christian apologists like Paul Copan and Clay Jones defending the unthinkable, ethnic cleansing and genocide, and God commanding the slaughter of civilian populations, I want to remove that as an obstacle to Christian belief so that people can be free to become Christians without having to sacrifice their moral conscience. And to me, that's part of my basic contribution to the apologetic enterprise. And most recently, with my book, How to Be Evangelical and Gay Affirming, I want to remove that obstacle that people have to becoming a Christian or to becoming an evangelical. If you would want to become an evangelical, which is, of course, an interesting question, I want to remove that objection. So when it comes to what convinces me Christianity is true and why have I decided to live as a Christian, well, in terms of my own background, you can read my book, which I didn't put up here, but What's So Confusing About Grace, where I talk about growing up Pentecostal, becoming Baptist, and finding that to be the place where I want to live out. And I find it to be a satisfactory understanding of reality. But this book I would recommend. More recently, my book, The Doubter's Creed, How to Be Christian When You Don't Believe It's True. Because here I really give a short 130-page overview framework for people who have a skeptical mindset to be able to work into Christian belief if they are at least sympathetic to it. So I wrote the book for sympathetic doubters and Christian disbelievers, or sorry, Christian doubters and sympathetic unbelievers. So the Christian doubters, people who identify as Christian but yet doubt, and sympathetic unbelievers, people who are not Christians but who are open to becoming Christians, and yet they find this construct of Christian doctrine you are expected to accept to be onerous. They just can't accept all of this. This book is tilling the soil and clearing the way for those people to begin to move into Christian belief by identifying, first of all, with like Jesus' call to love your neighbor as yourself, and then to love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, where we keep it open as to what God is, but just recognizing if there is something absolute beyond the material realm, then that's the something. If it's something noble, something good, then we can begin to live in oriented toward that transcendent thing, and then to move on from there further toward more Orthodox Christian doctrine. And at this point in my life, in my 50s, this kind of humble approach to Christian doctrine makes a lot of sense to me. For me to go back to the centrality of the moral framework, what is most important is not that you've got some high conviction about a long list of specific doctrines handed on to you by some historically conditioned understanding of orthodoxy, but rather, have you loved your neighbor as yourself? That is for me the most central question. And that for me really captures the heartbeat. And obviously, I fail to do that every day. But my unique contribution to apologetics is going to remain, I believe, in precisely the things that Squire talked about. So removing objections or defeaters, like people who object to Christianity because of same-sex, the perceived prohibition of same-sex relationships, or because of they can't sacrifice their moral conscience when it comes to accepting divinely commanded genocide, or all sorts of other issues, MAGA evangelicalism. I spent a lot of time obviously critiquing that because I think that is absolutely toxic, a toxic sacrifice of Orthodox Christianity. Just in the last few days. So we have evangelical apologists, or evangelical community, I should say, who talk about being pro-life. And yet, when Pete Hegseth brags about doing a double tap and murdering people on the high seas in the Caribbean with people who are essentially like prisoners, like shooting prisoners of war. So they've just bombed a boat and given no evidence that it was a drug running boat in the first place, let alone the tendentious framing that this boat somehow is at war with the United States, rather than even if they were drug runners, that they were just drug runners. And then having two people from that now bombed boat holding onto the side and Hegseth overseeing them shooting another missile to murder those people. And evangelicals do not say a peep about that because they don't care about life. They're not pro life, just like they're not pro life when it comes to guns killing people, 15,000 people every year. Just like they're not pro life when it comes to wanting to have medical care for all, and on and on and on. They're just pro life about being in life in utero for citizens, but I don't think for people who are refugees, for example. And that is so toxic to the Christian witness in the world. You know what would be infinitely more valuable? To have an irrefutable cosmological argument or just an irrefutable philosophical argument for God's existence in three or four steps, or to have Christians actually living out consistently their convictions. And I'm of the persuasion that far more important would be Christians living like Jesus rather than a seemingly irrefutable philosophical argument for God's existence. That's kind of like where the space in which I am. Um, that's why I don't do as much conventional apologetics. I'm just not that interested in arguing for cosmological arguments or even really arguing at this point for moral arguments. I would rather argue from a moral framework, remove the objections and doubts that people have and the skepticism they have toward Orthodox Christianity and help them find their way into it. I guess one last thing I'll just deal with. So a person might be saying, yeah, but you still haven't provided a reason why Christianity rather than some other religion. Well, I mean, look, all I can say in one sense is Christianity seems to me to be true. I was raised as a Christian. I've never had a reason to stop being a Christian. I don't know what more you want from me. What I get a little bit skeptical of is when people talk about, well, I surveyed all of the world's philosophies and religions, and I've decided X or Y is true. I roll my eyes internally when I hear that. Because look, nobody's surveyed all of the world's philosophies and religions and then made a magisterial view from nowhere decision as to which one they will believe or adhere to or live by. That's an artificial construct because we're all finite, limited beings, and you cannot begin to understand the totality of just one of the world's leading philosophies or religions by devoting your life to it, let alone to understand all of them and to make an informed, objective decision as to which one you will follow. That's just part of what it is to be a finite human being. And also, for my own soteriology and eschatology, for my view of salvation and of final things in the end, my own view of inclusivism and of a very hopeful universalism really lists the obligation to have to get all the right views and all the right beliefs in this life before you die, but rather to this much I know, and this comes back to the Doubter's Creed, to love my neighbor as myself. If I'm striving to do that, gosh darn it, I'm already, I would say, 90% of the way there.